Welcome to Literary Deep Dives with Sid. I am Sid, and today we will be deep diving literarily into The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, who is a French author, which means if you are going to be reading this book in English, you get to choose your translation. I prefer the anonymous translation from 1846 because I feel like the language is really immersive and I feel like I'm in that time period. But if you would like to choose a more modern, accessible translation, that's the amazing thing about reading books that have been translated. This book was released serially in 130 different sections between 1844 and 1846. So if you would like to read this book one chapter at a time over the period of several months or even years, you're actually going to get a very accurate experience to what the original readers would have had themselves. Or of course, you can read it all at once. You can also read it in sections. I will be presenting this plot in 10 different sections that I have sort of marked as where I think the plots segment themselves naturally. I will frequently just pick up with a certain section in the middle of the book and read it as like a little mini episode. This book is filled with romance and adventure and all kinds of fun things, and so you really don't need to read the entire book all at once to appreciate it and get some enjoyment out of it. If you are going to read with the anonymous 1846 translation, there is a LibriVox audiobook by David Clark that's in the public domain. It's available in lots of different places. I absolutely recommend it. It's a really great audiobook. Okay, before we dive into the characters and plot, we have to cover two important things. One is politics, which we'll get to in a minute. You have to understand the politics in order to understand this book. And the other is honor. So one of the themes in this book is moral ambiguity. We can't use the law to determine justice because the same act, the very same act, can be interpreted either as heroic patriotism or a treasonous crime, literally just depending on whose butt happens to be on the throne at the moment. You also can't use religion in this book because there's kind of a debate between whether God is fatalistic and we must passively submit to his will, or whether God calls agents to act on his behalf. So the moral code used in this book is honor. And honor, according to Alexandre Dumas, according to this French culture that he's writing in, this 1844 time period, honor is king. And honor means loyalty, courage, duty, and integrity. I'll say that again because these are very important. Loyalty, courage, duty, and integrity. And so if you do those things and you have those things, you have honor, so you're a good guy. It's really that simple. The opposite of this, of course, is betrayal, cowardice, greed, and hypocrisy. So if you're displaying those things, you don't have honor and you're a bad guy. One thing that is very important to understand before you get into this book is that the only way to get out of a sticky situation when crap hits the fan in this book, if you want to retain your honor, is suicide. I'm not kidding. The only way to maintain your honor when you are compromised is suicide. There's going to be a lot of that in this book. Buckle up. So you have to understand honor in order to appreciate the poetic justice that Dumas is going to present. Whether you agree with it personally or not, you can't use 2026 ideas of good and evil to understand the Count of Monte Cristo. So with that, Dantes begins as this very innocent, honorable, honestly naive dude, very hot, always very hot. But by the end of the book, he has quite a long list of crimes: smuggling, deceit, fraud, manipulation, kidnapping, aiding and abetting murder, organized crime, extortion, etc. So it's important to understand that Edmond Dantes, he's a Byronic hero. He has trauma, he's complex, he's not this perfect good guy. He acts really from heartbreak and trauma, and I would really advise you to think critically when you judge his character and when you judge his actions. Some questions that you can ask yourself as I present this plot and as you read this book: do Dantes' sufferings justify his vengeance? Was the Count really the agent of Providence? If not, is he excused because of his trauma? Did he actually bring about justice? Did he bring about more good or more harm? Is it possible to exact justice without hurting innocence? And one that I think about a lot, did Mercedes and Albert ultimately receive justice for their actions? Okay, let's talk about some politics here. They really drive the plot forward, especially in the beginning of the book. From 1789 to 1799, we have the French Revolution, in which the monarchy was overthrown. So those who support the king and the monarchy, I refer to as royalists. So at this point, they're in trouble. From 1799 to 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte reigned, and I refer to the followers of Napoleon Bonaparte as Bonapartists. So you have this counterplay between the royalists and the Bonapartists. They hate each other. They have completely opposite endeavors. In 1814, which is when our story begins, Louis XVIII is on the throne, and Napoleon Bonaparte has been exiled to the island of Elba. However, for a brief period in 1815 called the 100 Days, Bonaparte escaped the island of Elba and reigned. But after that very brief period, we were back to King Louis XVIII reigning. So the royalists are back on top here. And it's a royalist regime for the rest of the book. A lot of the events are going to take place in 1838, where Louis Philippe is on the throne. And so we're back to the royalist regime. But that, like I said, that counterplay between the royalists and the Bonapartes is really what drives the plot forward. So without further ado, let's get into it. Part 1, the plot. First, I'll introduce the characters that are going to be in this section. We have Edmond Dantes. He is the protagonist of this book. He is going to become the Count of Monte Cristo. He's incredibly intelligent. He's gorgeous. He's reeking with honor. And at this point in the book, he's very naive and innocent. And he is the first mate of the Pharaon. Monsieur Morel owns the Pharaon. He is honorable and generous. And even though he is not going to be in most of the rest of the book, all of his family will be. And if you see the name Morel, know that it's a good guy. They all have honor. Then we have Danglars. He is the first of the big four who betrayed Dantes. He's greedy, jealous, and cruel, and the primary thing that he wants is money. And when we start out, he is the supercargo of the Pharaon. Then we have old Dantes, who is Edmond Dantes' father. He's about to die, so he's not that important. Then there's Gaspard Caderousse, who is the second of the big four who betrayed Dantes. He is similar to Danglars in that he wants money, but rather than being intelligent and cunning, he is cowardly and opportunistic. Then we have Mercedes, who is a beautiful orphan, and she at this point in the book is honorable. And her cousin, Fernand Mondego, who is obsessed with her. He is traitorous, lustful, and selfish. He's the third of the big four, and all he wants is Mercedes. Then we have Gerard de Villefort, who is the fourth of the big four. He is a procureur, which is essentially a judge. He's ambitious, selfish, and ruthless. He will cut down anyone to get to the top. He's engaged to Renée de Saint-Méran, who could not be further from him. She is angelic, sweet, innocent, and gentle, and she's about to die, so you don't need to remember her. But her daughter is exactly like her, and she's one of the main protagonists of this book. She is the daughter of the Marquis and Marchioness de Saint-Méran, who are wealthy, aristocratic royalists. Villefort, royalist. However, Villefort's father, Noirtier, is a Bonapartist. He's a huge Bonapartist leader. He's very powerful and wealthy. And he, in this section, murders General de Canel, who is a royalist general who is loyal and honorable. All right, let's get into it. This is the 24th of February, 1814. The Pharaon docks in Marseille with Edmond Dantes as acting captain. The previous captain, Leclerc, a Bonapartist, had been tasked with delivering a letter to the Isle of Elba, where Napoleon Bonaparte is exiled. But Captain Leclerc died before he could complete his mission, so Dantes, ever loyal to his captain, had fulfilled the mission on Leclerc's behalf, bringing back a letter to be delivered to someone in Paris. Danglars, the Pharaon's supercargo, complains to Monsieur Morel, the owner of the Pharaon, that Dantes arrogantly took charge of the vessel and lost a whole day at the island of Elba. Morel remarks that taking charge of the ship was Dantes' duty as first mate and makes Dantes the official captain of the Pharaon. Astonished at his good fortune, Dantes pays his first visit to his father, referred to in the book as Old Dantes. Before he left on his voyage, Dantes had given his father 200 francs to live off of, but as soon as Dantes set sail, their neighbor Caderousse came to demand payment of a debt that Dantes had owed to him. Old Dantes honored the debt and has been living, or starving, on just 60 francs for the last 3 months. On hearing this, Dantes is horrified with guilt, but the two rejoice over Dantes' promotion and believe their days of poverty are behind them. Dantes' second visit is to his fiancée, the beautiful Mercedes. Mercedes is an orphan who lives primarily off the charity of others and the support of her cousin Fernand, who is desperately in love with her. She declares that she loves Fernand as a brother, but will accept no husband but Dantes, and that if anything were to happen to Dantes, she would kill herself. Outside a tavern, Danglars, Fernand, and Caderousse discuss their jealousy and hatred of Dantes. Danglars, who knows Dantes is in possession of a letter from the island of Elba in royalist France, proposes denouncing him as a Bonapartist. Caderousse, completely plastered, eggs on the other two, but expresses anxiety when he realizes the gravity of their plan. To appease him, Danglars cunningly crumbles up the letter that he had written to denounce Dantes and threw it in a corner. However, Fernand retrieves and posts the letter. At Dantes' and Mercedes' betrothal feast, old Dantes, Monsieur Morel, and all of Dantes' shipmates celebrate with him, but the festivities are soon interrupted by a group of gendarmes who arrest Dantes, offering no explanation. Across town, another betrothal feast is taking place. Gerard de Villefort, the deputy procureur, has become engaged to Renée de Saint-Méran, who is the daughter of extremely wealthy royalist aristocrats, the Marquis and Marchioness de Saint-Méran. The scene is primarily a royalist political discussion, and all present encourage Villefort, for the sake of his own career, to place as much distance between himself and his Bonapartist father, Noirtier. Villefort is suddenly called away to examine Dantes. The angelic Renée requests that Villefort show mercy to the accused party. Villefort reads the letter in Dantes' possession, finding it to contain a plot to liberate Napoleon from exile and return him to power. His interview with Dantes reveals that Dantes is clearly innocent of any crime or party affiliations. However, just as he is about to set Dantes free, he asks Dantes to disclose the name of the person to whom the letter was to be delivered. The name of the person was Noirtier. Trusting in Villefort's word, Dantes allows himself to be taken to the Château d'If, and as a result of his confused struggles when he finds himself imprisoned, he is sent to the dungeon. Meanwhile, Villefort, eager to bury his father's name and take advantage of the situation he has become privy to, rushes to the Tuileries to speak with the king himself. He claims that Dantes was a Bonapartist spy whom he had been watching for months, and that he had intercepted an oral message from him about the plot. The king doesn't believe in the danger at first, but the minister of police burst in at that moment to announce the confirmed escape of Napoleon. The king grants high honors to Villefort, who, upon returning to his hotel, finds his father waiting for him. Noirtier is on the run, having been rightfully suspected of the murder of General de Canel. And Villefort, anxious to keep his father's crimes under the radar, helps him disguise himself. During the 100 Days, the temporary second reign of Napoleon, Morel applies to Villefort multiple times to secure Dantes' release, because his once treasonous crime is now patriotic under the reign of Napoleon. But Villefort thwarts all his efforts. After the king is reestablished, Dantes' fate is sealed. Morel continually attempts to support old Dantes in his son's absence, once placing a red silk purse full of money on his mantle. But old Dantes eventually dies of grief, and Morel pays his funeral expenses. Part 2, the Château d'If. This takes place from 1814 to 1829, so he's in the prison for 14 years. Edmond Dantes, who was once naive and innocent, is becoming disillusioned. And the only other character that we're really going to meet in this section is the Abbé Faria. Abbé is an Italian word for like priest or father. The Abbé Faria is very intelligent and religious and industrious, and these two end up developing like a father-son type of bond. Dantes spends a total of 14 years in the Château d'If. In the dungeon, he remains confined to his cell 24/7, sees no humans other than his jailer, and is not afforded exercise, fresh air, books, etc. After several years of despair, he finally attempts to starve himself to death. Just as he is on the point of death, he hears a fellow prisoner digging into the wall of his cell. He aborts his plan to starve himself and begins digging to meet the prisoner halfway. Eventually, the prisoner is finally able to break into the wall of Dantes' cell, and they embrace, overjoyed to see another human being. The prisoner is the Abbé Faria, an Italian political prisoner guilty only of opinions differing from the ruling party at the time of his imprisonment. Dantes had heard that there was a prisoner in the dungeon who was crazy, believing he had found the map to a treasure, and frequently bribed visitors to the prison with 5 million in exchange for his freedom. The abbé proves, however, to be incredibly intelligent and industrious, even using his meager resources to fashion pens, ink, and paper, as well as a rope ladder. He had been working for several years on the manuscript he hoped to have published once he escaped, and he had been digging to reach the outer wall of the prison where he would have climbed down and swam away. However, a miscalculation resulted in him digging into Dantes' cell instead, wasting years of work. The abbé becomes a second father to Dantes, teaching him many languages and disciplines. He even helps Dantes work out why he was imprisoned and who is to blame. They plan to begin digging to escape again, but the abbé succumbs to an attack that leaves him paralyzed and unable to make the swim required. Dantes refuses to leave him behind and vows to give up the escape attempt. The abbé reveals to Dantes that the story he had heard about him bribing prison guards with treasure is true, and launches into backstory number 1. The abbé once worked as a secretary for Cardinal Spada, who was the rightful inheritor of an incredibly large but unfortunately long-lost treasure. When the cardinal died, he left the abbé everything, and when the abbé was going through his legal papers, he discovered that hitherto invisible words suddenly appeared on a certain very old piece of paper when it was held up to a flame. The abbé realized these words were the instructions to the long-lost treasure, which was hidden on the island of Monte Cristo. Unfortunately for the abbé, he was arrested before he could make the search and claim the treasure. As the abbé views Dantes as his son, he wishes now to bequeath the treasure to Dantes once Dantes escapes. A few days later, the abbé suffers another attack which proves fatal. Dantes removes the abbé from his burial shroud and places him on the bed in his own cell. Dantes sews himself up inside the shroud, but the cemetery of the Chateau d'If is the sea, and Dantes is thrown headlong into the water, but he is miraculously able to cut himself free from the shroud and manages to get to the surface of the water, swimming to the shore of an island. In part 3 of this story, Edmond Dantes is primarily going to be acting under aliases. He has not quite emerged as the Count of Monte Cristo, but he's still not really Edmond Dantes anymore. He's kind of like in an in-between phase. We've got Monsieur Morel, who has still retained his honor and is still a great guy, but he is suffering financially. We're introduced to his son, Maximilian, and his daughter, Julie, who is engaged to a guy named Emmanuel, but because of the financial difficulties, they're not able to get married yet. We're reintroduced to Gaspard Caderousse and his wife, La Carconte, who are running the Pont du Gard Inn. That's a key detail that will come up many times throughout the book. And we are going to discover that Danglars has become a baron, extremely wealthy, and that Fernand Mondego has become Le Comte de Morcerf. And he married Mercedes, which makes her La Comtesse de Morcerf. So they are both very, very rich and powerful. Part 3, rewards. This takes place in 1829. Dantes is picked up by a vessel of smugglers claiming to be the only survivor of another sailing vessel. He quickly gains their trust through his natural sailing and leadership skills. He signs on to their crew and waits patiently for the right opportunity to search the island. His chance finally comes when his vessel is scheduled to make a stop at the island of Monte Cristo. Once there, he fakes an injury and claims he is in too much pain to move or be moved, and requests that the crew leave him with provisions and come pick him up in a few days. When he's finally alone, he searches the island and finds the treasure, thanks to the instructions from the Abbé Faria. When he returns to the island to land with the sailors, he purchases a yacht with special secret compartments to take him to collect his treasure. He then inquires after his loved ones. Old Dantes has died, and Mercedes hasn't been seen in many years. Under the alias of an Englishman, Lord Wilmore, Dantes purchases his old home. He begins a pattern of flamboyant generosity with all he deals with. Now disguised as the Abbé Busoni, Dantes goes to the Pont du Gard Inn, which is now owned and operated by Caderousse and his wife, who is called La Carconte. He tells Caderousse that as a religious officer, he prayed over Dantes in his last moments in prison. Caderousse expresses genuine remorse for his involvement in the betrayal, true admiration for Dantes, and even admits to having been guilty of jealousy and cowardice. The abbé alleges that Dante had received a valuable diamond as a gift from a wealthy fellow prisoner, and that on Dantès' death he requested of the abbé that the profits be divided amongst his 5 dearest loved ones: old Dantès, Mercédès, Fernand, Caderousse, and Danglars. Despite warnings from his wife, Caderousse decides to tell the abbé about the fate of the other 4 so that he can retain the full value of the diamond for himself. He shares the following histories. Old Dantès died of grief and starvation just weeks after Dantès was taken to prison. Mercédès married Fernand just 18 months after Dantès' arrest. Fernand, through serving in the army and betraying the right people at the right times, attained many great honors, earned a considerable fortune, and rose in the aristocracy. He is now known as Le Comte de Morcerf and is a member of the House of Peers, making Mercédès La Comtesse de Morcerf. Danglars also earned money in the war, and through speculation, has acquired a spectacular fortune. He married a woman of extremely high birth and is now known as the Baron Danglars. Dantès gives Caderousse the diamond and takes on a new disguise as a representative of the House of Thomson and French, which is a Roman bank, to visit the prison office. He meets with Monsieur de Beauville, the inspector of prisons, who informs him that he is about to lose an investment with the House of Morel and Son for 200,000 francs, which was intended to be his daughter's dowry. Dantès claims that he had been educated by the Abbé Faria and that he is anxious to learn the particulars of his death. He offers to purchase the debt, reimbursing Monsieur de Beauville for his loss if he answers a few questions and allows him to peruse the prison records. He learns that Edmond Dantès is assumed to have died in the fall to the sea and sees in the records that Monsieur Morel worked tirelessly to secure his release, but that all efforts were thwarted by Villefort. He also pockets the letter Danglars had written denouncing him. Morel has lost several ships, and if the Pharaon, which is several weeks late, does not return safely, he will be bankrupt. Without any capital, he will be unable to supply his daughter Julie, with the dowry that would enable her to marry her fiancé Emmanuel. Still disguised as a representative from the House of Thomson and French, Dantès purchases all of Morel's debts around town. He then presents himself to Morel and gives him a bill totaling 287,500 francs. Suddenly, the crew of the Pharaon burst into the house. They bring news that the Pharaon and all its cargo were lost in a terrible storm and that they only survived by being picked up by another vessel. The representative of Thomson and French has compassion on Morel after witnessing this pitiful scene and extends the due date of the bill until the 5th of September, which is 3 months away. As he leaves the house, he secretly informs Julie that she will soon receive a letter signed Sinbad the Sailor and that she must obey the letter exactly. Unfortunately, with all his ships and capital now lost, Morel is unable to pay the debt, so to retain his honorable name, he plans to commit suicide on the 5th of September. His son, Maximilian, is called home at the time of crisis. On the 5th of September, Julie interrupts Morel's suicide attempt by exclaiming that after following the instructions in a letter she received, she found a red silk purse on a mantle in old Dantès' house, containing a receipt for payment of the bill from the House of Thomson and French, as well as a large diamond marked for her dowry. Just as she finishes her explanation, the sounds of a boat are heard entering the harbor. It is a vessel marked the Pharaon, carries the very same cargo the Pharaon was expecting, and is even operated by the very same crew. Dantès watches the shocked and grateful family from afar and declares a farewell to all good feelings as he turns his heart toward vengeance. Part 4, Rome, is by far my favorite section of this book. Sometimes I will read it just on its own. It kind of reads like a mini, adventure novella. We have 2 totally new protagonists, Albert and Franz, and the Count of Monte Cristo has now emerged as this almost mythic figure, and he's no longer Edmond Dantès. Huge character shift here. And before we get into this, we need to discuss all of Edmond Dantès' aliases because they can get pretty confusing. The first is Abbé Busoni, who is an Italian priest who is heavily involved in prison work. He's also a friend of the Count of Monte Cristo, who is a son of a Tuscan shipbuilder who discovered a silver mine, which is what gave him all his wealth, He purchased the island of Monte Cristo in order to obtain the title of Count, but his name was originally Zaccone, and he had an affair with Lord Wilmore's wife. Now, who, you may ask, is Lord Wilmore? Another one of Edmond Dantes' aliases. He is a British philanthropist who poses as another alias within an alias, a representative of the House of Thomson and French. This is who visited Morel. And he also poses as an eccentric bandit captain named Sinbad the Sailor, who has a fabulous grotto on the island of Monte Cristo, and he is an enemy of the Count of Monte Cristo and has fought many duels with him. So Edmond Dantes gets a little crazy with his aliases, but I'm mainly going to refer to him as the Count of Monte Cristo, who is vengeful, still very intelligent, but mysterious, wealthy, and powerful. Now, he has a ward named Haiti, who is formerly a Greek slave. She's beautiful, honorable, tragic, vengeful. She's an orphan. He purchased her freedom and is now raising her as his daughter, and he treats her like an absolute queen. Then we have the Vicomte Albert de Morcerf and Baron Franz d'Épinay, who are Albert is the son of Mercedes and Fernand, and Franz is the son of General de Canal, who Noirtier assassinated in the beginning of the book. It can be difficult to keep these characters separate in who they are, but they actually could not be more different. They are foils for each other. Albert's around 20 and Franz is around 25, but even though there's only 5 years between them, there might as well be like 20, because while Franz is mature, perceptive, thoughtful, very skeptical, he was orphaned at the age of 2 and he came into his title very early. He's traveled the world, so he's very mature, very experienced, and he's almost acting as not a guardian, they call it a cicerone for Albert, who, on the other hand, is immature, vain, credulous, rash. He's a mama's boy, but that doesn't mean he's a bad character. He's also absolutely hilarious, and these two characters are both very honorable. In fact, all the characters on this board are just reeking with honor. All right, let's get into the summary of part 4. This all takes place in 1838, so a lot of time has passed since the beginning of the book. Albert de Morcerf and Franz d'Épinay decide to attend the carnival at Rome together. They make reservations at the hotel of Signor Pastrini, but are only able to secure 2 rooms as the rest of their floor is occupied by the extremely wealthy count. And for these Richie boys, 2 rooms is not enough. With a few days left before their reservation, the two split up, and Franz hires a boat to take him goat hunting. The captain, Gaetano, suggests that they try the island of Monte Cristo, where they encounter a group of smugglers and bandits having dinner on the shore. One of the smugglers approaches Franz and extends him an invitation for dinner from their leader. Gaetano tells Franz that their leader is rumored to abide in a fabulous underground palace, the entrance of which has never been located, and Franz agrees to the adventure. He is blindfolded and led into a grotto decked out with the finest exotic furnishings. The leader introduces himself as Sinbad the Sailor, and Franz introduces himself as Aladdin. They share an incredible meal together and then trip on hashish, which is a concentrated form of marijuana. Franz hallucinates that the beautiful female statues that decorate the grotto come to life and make out with him. When he awakens, he finds that he has been moved to a cave during the night where he sees Sinbad the Sailor sailing away. He searches the island for hours but finds no entrance. He heads back to Rome, where Signor Pastrini assures him and Albert that it would be impossible for them to arrange to rent carriages during the carnival on such short notice. They are, however, able to get a carriage in the days leading up to the carnival, so they decide to visit the Colosseum that night. Signor Pastrini implores them not to go via the Porta del Popolo so late at night, as they are sure to be captured by banditti. Signor Pastrini then launches into backstory number 2. Luigi Vampa had always shown great intelligence and ambition, convincing a priest to teach him to read and write when he was 7 years old. As a shepherd, he grew up alongside a beautiful young shepherdess named Teresa, and the two eventually fell in love. They often heard stories of local bandits, such as those led by Cucciametto, whose primary crimes were kidnapping, ransoming, and murdering their victims. One day, Vampa saw Cucciametto carrying off Teresa. After shooting and killing him, Vampa dressed in his clothes and presented himself to the bandits as their new leader. Albert is incredulous, but Franz, having just met with bandits himself, is more inclined to be cautious, and the two take a different route. At the Colosseum, Franz overhears a conversation between two men who he comes to realize are Sinbad the Sailor and Luigi Vampa. There will be two executions at the commencement of the carnival, and one of them, Peppino, helped out the bandits, so they want to see him released safely. Sinbad the Sailor tells Vampa that he will see to his release and that he is successful. The windows at the Cafe Rospoli will be specially decorated. After visiting the Colosseum, Albert and Franz head to the opera where they meet the Countess G. They don't give her name, they just call her the Countess G. They all admire the beauty of a woman in Grecian costume in one of the boxes. The Countess G tells them she is attended by a Nubian servant and escorted by the Count of Monte Cristo, a man who she compares to a vampire and is quite afraid of. The Count enters and Franz immediately recognizes him as Sinbad the Sailor. When Franz returns home, he and Albert are informed by Signor Pastrini that the Count of Monte Cristo, who is occupying the rest of the floor, has offered them seats in his carriage as well as the windows in the Cafe Rospoli for the viewing of the carnival. They visit the Count in his rooms to accept the invitation and are both wowed by the grandeur and excessive wealth of the Count. They discuss governmental justice and methods of execution. The Count has seen many executions across the world and studied all the systems of justice he has encountered. He declares that the death penalty, no matter how it is executed, is insufficient to recompense the sufferings the criminal may have inflicted. He tells him that he once heard that a Nubian was to be executed after having his tongue cut out. So he purchased the man, Ali, after his tongue had been cut out so that he could have a mute slave. The boys are horrified by the Count's fascination with death and justice as well as his cold indifference to cruelty and suffering. However, they are also dazzled by his wealth and power. At the execution, Peppino is pardoned, and Franz and Albert are deeply disturbed on witnessing the execution of the other man. However, they all dress in costume for the carnival and go out to the carriage to join the festivities. They frequently pass another carriage of people dressed like peasants, and Albert begins a flirtation with one of the girls inside. This flirtation continues several days, and Albert is completely smitten with her. She passes him a note instructing him to follow the woman who snatches his torch during the Moccoli the following day. When the moment arrives, Albert goes off with his lover, and Franz is left with an uneasy feeling. After several hours, Albert has not returned, and Franz receives a ransom note from Luigi Vampa, who had been the driver of the carriage, his lover Teresa being the peasant Albert had flirted with. Franz applies to the Count, knowing his influence over the bandits. They arrive at the catacombs, where Luigi Vampa apologizes to the Count for disturbing one of his friends, and Albert is set free. Albert, filled with gratitude, offers the Count anything he wishes. The Count requests an introduction into Parisian society, and they make a breakfast date for the 21st of May at 10:30 a.m. The two shake hands on the deal, and Franz notices the Count winced when he was forced to touch Albert. Franz finally shares his secret knowledge of the Count with Albert and expresses to him his suspicion and distrust of the Count, but Albert refuses to think ill of a man who saved his life. All right, part 5, which I call introductions. To me, this is when the book actually begins. If you want to start reading the book from here, go ahead. Parts 1 through 3 read as a little bit of a villain origin story or a prequel. Part 4 is a little bit of just like a fun intermission thrown in there. This is when the grand revenge plot actually begins. We have a lot of characters. Their webs are very entangled. That's what makes this plot so juicy and delicious. So we're going to go through this whole entire character tree really quick. For all intents and purposes, Maximilian Morel is now the Count of Monte Cristo's son. That's how he sees him. He's his guardian. He will do anything for Maximilian. And of course, Haidee, his Greek princess. So these are like his children. He only loves these two people. Everyone else, he pretends to be their friend, but actually he is trying to destroy them. So let's start with Albert, who we just left off on. We know that he is the son of Mercedes and Fernand, or who are now known as Le Comte and Comtesse de Morcerf. He has some really good friends. Baron Raoul de Chateau-Renaud, who is an aristocrat, and Beauchamp, who is a very honorable, very good friend, and he works as a journalist, and that will be very important. Another of his good friends is Lucien Debray, but I put him up here because Lucien Debray, the deceitful, cunning, greedy secretary to the Minister of the Interior, is having an affair with the Baroness Hermine Danglars, who we also refer to her as Madame Danglars throughout the book. She is married to Danglars, who again became a baron. She's crucial to this plot. Her deceitfulness and unfaithfulness and vanity are a major catalyst for a lot of the events in this plot. So the relationship between Madame Danglars and Lucien Debray is not strictly romantic. It is also financial. In fact, I think she is in love with him, but he only uses her for money. Lucien Debray is able to provide Madame Danglars with insider information, and she is able to communicate that to her husband, who uses it to make gains on the stock market, and then she gives a portion of that back to Lucien Debray. Their daughter, Eugénie Danglars, is engaged to Albert, and they hate each other. He is very much looking for a feminine woman, and Eugénie Danglars is anything but. She is one of my favorite characters in all of literature. She is a gift to the literary world. She is very masculine. She is an artist. She is direct and independent and pragmatic and rebellious, but not in a way where she's trying to be a girl boss or trying to be a strong female lead. Just in the way where she wants what she wants and she does what it takes to get it. She quietly wants to live her own life, and she is awesome. She's almost certainly a lesbian, and her best friend, Louis Darmy, who is also her piano teacher, they are pretty much lovers, and they're gonna run away together. So then, connecting from Baroness Hermine Danglars, she had an affair with Gerard de Villefort, and they had a son, Benedetto, who you'll come to find out later was taken to an orphanage and raised by Bertuccio, who was a servant of the Count of Monte Cristo, and Bertuccio's sister-in-law, Assunta. So Villefort was first married to Renée de Saint-Méran, who we already discussed. She's the daughter of the Marquis and Marchioness de Saint-Méran. And Villefort and Renée had a daughter named Valentine, who is sweet, angelic, gentle, and submissive, the ideal feminine of this time. She is engaged to Franz, but they do not want to marry each other. I don't know why. Valentine should be so lucky. Franz is my favorite character in this whole book. But she is in love with Maximilian Morel. Their love story, the rest of the story is going to really hinge around that. Renée de Saint-Méran died pretty soon into the book, and Gerard de Villefort remarried Eloise de Villefort, who is cunning, murderous, greedy, and her primary motivations are a mother's love for her son, Edouard de Villefort, who's a menace. He is a spoiled mama's boy. And then, of course, Franz's father is General de Canel, as we will remember. And then Benedetto, who is the illegitimate child, remember, of Madame Danglars and Villefort. He went to prison and was cellmates with Caderousse, so they have that connection there. This is going to be really important later on. Part 5, Introductions. This is still 1838. On the 21st of May, the first of Albert's friends to arrive at his separate apartments is Lucien Debray, the secretary to the Minister of the Interior, followed by Beauchamp, a journalist, and Chateau Renaud, an aristocrat. Chateau Renaud brings along Maximilien Morel and tells the group how Maximilien saved his life at great personal risk in Africa. Albert tells them all about their mysterious, eccentric, and fabulously wealthy guest, the Count of Monte Cristo. He recounts the tale of the bandit kidnapping and even includes some details from Franz's adventures. Finally, the Count himself is announced. He dazzles Albert's friends with every word he utters. At one point, he mentions the house of Thompson in French, and Maximilien beseeches the Count to tell him anything he can concerning that house, recounting to the group the story of his father's miraculous restoration. The Count agrees to visit the Morels to discuss the connection. After the guests depart, Albert introduces the Count to his parents. Mercedes is overcome with emotion, both with gratitude toward the man who saved her life, as well as recognition of her past lover, Edmond Dantes. The Count masks his emotions, and upon his departure, Mercedes questions Albert about the Count's identity. The Count begins setting up his affairs in Paris by purchasing a house at Auteuil. He informs his servant, Bertuccio, of this fact, who begins to express severe terror and dread of the house. Bertuccio alludes to the circumstance that brought him into the Count's employ, whereby he was recommended into the Count's service by the Abbé Busoni, who is the Count, who had received Bertuccio's confession when he was in prison. The Count demands that Bertuccio explain his connection to the house at Auteuil. Bertuccio launches into backstory number 3. Bertuccio had been brought up by his brother and his brother's wife, Assunta, in Corsica. In 1815, on his way back from the war, his brother was murdered. He demanded justice of Villefort, the king's attorney, who brushed aside the crime as a war inevitability. Bertuccio declared a vendetta against Villefort and stalked him to a house at Auteuil one night, where he saw an enceinte woman and doctor into the house. Shortly thereafter, he saw Villefort steal into the garden with a box and begin digging. He sprang on Villefort and stabbed him, making off with the box. After running away, Bertuccio opened the box and discovered the body of a child inside. He resuscitated the child, and took it to a foundling hospital, but retained a piece of the initialed blanket it was wrapped in case Assunta encouraged him to reclaim it later. When he returned home, Assunta did just that, and after retrieving the child from the orphanage, he and Assunta raised it as their own to atone for the vendetta, even naming him Benedetto. Unfortunately, Benedetto was wayward, and after becoming involved in local gangs, he even murdered Assunta when she refused to give him money. In 1829, Bertuccio, now a smuggler, was running from the gendarmes when he took refuge at a shed in the Pont du Gard Inn. Just as he secreted himself, he saw Caderousse entering with a man, and the two were discussing the sale of a large diamond. This is the diamond that the Abbé Busoni gave to him in return for the information. They have got a jeweler to come and purchase the diamond, but La Carconte convinced Caderousse to double their money by killing the jeweler and taking the money and the diamond. Just as he secreted himself, he saw Caderousse entering with a man, and the two were discussing the sale of a large diamond. La Carconte's eyes sparkled with greed and determination. A storm prevented the jeweler from leaving with the diamond, so he stayed the night at the inn. Bertuccio awoke to sounds and entered the inn to find that the jeweler had been stabbed and La Carconte had been shot. Gendarmes burst in and caught Bertuccio in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thankfully, the Abbé Busoni was able to provide a witness for Caderousse's motive for the crime, and Bertuccio was set free after the Abbé received his confession. The Count orders Bertuccio to purchase a fine pair of horses he sees in the streets, despite their exorbitant price. Then he visits Danglars to open up a line of credit for 6 million francs. 6 million francs. Danglars is staggered by such a large sum, but so as not to injure his own pride, he accepts. At the Danglars household, Hermine Danglars is in her chamber with her lover Debray when Danglars presents the Count of Monte Cristo. Madame Danglars is furious with her husband when she sees out the window that her precious dappled greys are harnessed to the Count's carriage. The Count departs discreetly, but later gifts the horses back to her, free of charge, with diamonds embedded into their harnesses. Eloise de Villefort, a friend of Madame Danglars, had requested to borrow the horses that afternoon to go riding with her son, Edouard. The Count informs Ali that a pair of wild horses will soon cross in front of the house and that Ali is to use his lasso to arrest the horses in front of the house. Ali does so, and the Count brings Madame de Villefort and her son, Edouard, into his house. She is frantic with anxiety for her son, who is unconscious, but the Count administers a single drop from a special vial, and he revives. Madame de Villefort is overwhelmed with gratitude, and both stories connected with the Dapple Greys circulate all over Paris society, giving notoriety and awe to the Count. To thank the Count for saving his wife and child, Villefort visits the Count, who harasses him throughout the entire interview, announcing himself, albeit vaguely, as an avenging angel, and declaring that he fears only death, and that is the only thing that could arrest his plans. Villefort leaves astounded at this eccentric character. In her chambers at home, the Count informs his Greek slave, Haydée, whom he loves as a daughter, that she is free now that they are on French soil. She declares that she will never leave the Count, as she loves him even more than a father. Part 6. Pyramus and Thisbe. Don't worry, it's still me. I just changed my clothes. The Count pays a visit to the Morels, but does not disclose his identity despite their pleas for information on their savior from the House of Thompson and French. He finds that they are happy, honorable, virtuous, and ever grateful for his anonymous charity, still prizing the red silk purse that had contained their salvation. We are then introduced to the relationship between Maximilien Morel and Valentine de Villefort, who love each other passionately but have not shared their secret with a soul. They communicate through the cracks of the fence behind the garden of her house. The angelic Valentine, despite being fabulously wealthy as the sole heiress of both her grandparents' large fortunes, feels oppressed by her parents and has no allies in her life other than Maximilien and her grandfather Noirtier, who is now paralyzed from a stroke and communicates only through blinking. Valentine is suddenly called away from her rendezvous with Maximilien to receive the visit of the Count of Monte Cristo. She finds the Count conversing with her stepmother. When Valentine retires, the Count and Madame discuss poisons, conscience, escaping justice, and building up immunity to certain poisons by increasing the dosage over time. At the opera, Albert meets with Chateau Renaud, in whom he confides that he is not attracted to his own betrothed, Eugénie Danglars. The Count enters along with Haydée, and all admire her beauty, especially Eugénie. Haydée sees Le Comte de Morcerf and becomes irate, revealing to the Count that he was the man who betrayed her father and sold her into slavery, and the Count and Haydée leave in the 4th act. The Count begins setting up a portion of his revenge plot by secretly hiring 2 men to pose as fictitious, wealthy Italian aristocrats. A father, Major Bartolomeo Cavalcanti, and his long-lost son, Prince Andrea Cavalcanti. The 2 criminals each received a letter from either Lord Wilmore or Sinbad the Sailor, instructing them to present themselves in exchange for a large sum of money to the Count of Monte Cristo, posing as each of their respective characters. Neither of the criminals knows for what purpose they have been hired, but they each follow the instructions, where they are delighted to find that they received the large sums of money promised. The Count, pretending to be oblivious to any deception, claiming to have been informed by his friends Lord Wilmore and Sinbad the Sailor that he is to help reunite the estranged pair, meets with them and invites both of them to a dinner he is hosting at his house at Auteuil, to which he has also invited, among others, the Villeforts and the Danglars. Benedetto will now be playing the part of Prince Andrea Cavalcanti for the majority of the rest of the book. The Villeforts announce to Noirtier the engagement of their daughter Valentine to Franz d'Épinay. The old man, though paralyzed, expresses extreme consternation through his expression. He signals for Valentine to be sent for, and through the use of a system they have devised whereby Noirtier signals yes or no through blinking and winking, Noirtier confirms that he wants to see a notary. When the notary arrives, they explain the communication system to him, and Noirtier reveals to the notary that he will disinherit Valentine, his former sole heiress, if she marries Franz, and that his 900,000 franc fortune will be donated to charity. While this angers Villefort, it does not determine him from continuing to press the engagement. Madame de Villefort is outraged that as Noirtier disinherited Valentine, he refused to transfer the inheritance to her son Edouard. Meanwhile, the Count visits the home of a telegraph relayer and bribes him to falsify a political report being communicated to the Minister of the Interior. This erroneous report that Don Carlos has fled and returned to Spain is of course heard by Lucien Debray, the minister's secretary, and it later appeared in that day's newspaper. All of Paris converses about how fortunate Danglars was to have sold all his Spanish bonds, albeit at a loss, just in time to have avoided even greater losses. The next day, however, the newspapers correct the false information. The stocks rise 1% higher, and Danglars, who sold at a loss, sustains a total loss of over 1 million francs. This allows the Count to confirm his suspicion that Madame Danglars and her lover, Lucien Debray, were using his insider knowledge of political affairs to speculate with Danglars' money. Part 7, I call this Let the Games Begin, because this is when all the dominoes that the Count of Monte Cristo has been setting up finally begin to start falling, and they do so in a very juicy, delicious way. This is also the section, though, where we start to question whether or not we're on the Count's side anymore. We loved Edmond Dantes in the beginning. We cheered for him. Now we're getting to the point where he starts ruining some people that we have learned to really love in this book. And that's a theme that's going to continue. In fact, that's one of the main themes of this book, is the Count justified in his actions. All right, let the games begin. The guests all arrive at Auteuil for the Count's dinner, and Madame Danglars and Villefort are noticeably agitated. The Count presents Major Cavalcanti and his son, Prince Andrea Cavalcanti, to the group and mentions to Danglars that Andrea is looking for a wife in Paris. Bertuccio recognizes Andrea Cavalcanti to be in actuality his adopted ward, and Villefort and Madame Danglars' illegitimate child. He also recognizes Villefort, whom he mistakenly believed he had killed, as well as Madame Danglars, whom he reveals to the Count was the enchante woman who had entered the house that fateful night. At dinner, the guests are dazzled by the exotic foods, luxurious furnishings, and the fact that the Count was able to transform the entire house in less than a week. The Count explains that he has kept only one room exactly as he found it, finding it to have a foreboding atmosphere, and claiming to have the intuition that a horrible crime must have been committed there. Having intrigued his guests, he leads them into this room, where he narrates the story of the night Villefort's illegitimate child was born, pretending to have arrived at these speculations from the mere vibes and furnishings of the room itself. Madame Danglars can scarcely keep from fainting, and Villefort himself can barely stay upright. The Count then leads them into the garden and claims that his gardener had found the body of a newborn baby, having been buried alive under the tree, and even leads Villefort by the arm to the very spot. Completely exhausted from terror and suspicion, Madame Danglars and Villefort secretly plan to meet at his office the next day to discuss their situation. The guests all depart, and when Andrea begins his journey, his carriage is stopped by Caderousse, his former fellow prisoner who has recognized him to be Benedetto. Having noticed that he was well dressed, wore a diamond ring on his finger, and rode in a fine carriage, and assuming that he did not come by these means honestly, Caderousse suddenly threatens to expose Benedetto if he does not pay him 200 francs every month. Benedetto agrees. After the dinner in Madame Danglars' boudoir, her husband confronts her about the speculation schemes between her and Debray. He explains that he has known all along that she wasn't just having dreams and premonitions about stocks that turned out to be financially lucrative, and that he has always been perfectly aware of her love affairs. He reveals that he has turned a blind eye as long as it has benefited him financially, but now that Debray's false information has dealt a blow to his fortune, he expects to be compensated. He has always shared his stock market increases with his wife, whom he knows Debray has been pocketing, and now expects the lovers to share in his losses as well by paying him back a portion of the million he lost in Spanish bonds. He announces that Debray will no longer be welcome in the house and that their days of speculating risk-free with his money are over. The next day, Danglars visits the Count and they discuss multiple catastrophic losses that Danglars' fortune has sustained over the last few days. The Count reminds him that as his fortune is based on speculation and lending, it has no security and multiple similar losses could ruin him. Danglars brings up the fact that Andrea Cavalcanti is looking for a wife, and the Count claims that the Cavalcantis are fabulously wealthy and would likely pay 2 or 3 millions to the family that they marry Andrea to. When Danglars points out that his daughter is already engaged to Albert de Morcerf, the Count subtly inserts that he once heard the name of Fernand Mondego connected with an affair in Greece concerning Ali Pasha's betrayal. He suggests that Danglars write to Yanina concerning the particulars of the affair. Madame Danglars and Villefort secretly meet in his office to discuss the danger of the Count being privy to their secret. Villefort explains that the Count could not have found a dead body under the tree and tells the rest of his side of the story. Backstory number 4. After he had been stabbed, Madame Danglars and her nurse had managed to drag him back inside and get him to the hospital. He had spent 3 months recovering in Versailles, after which he had been returned to the house at Auteuil and dug up the whole garden, but the search had been unsuccessful. Determining that the Corsican had absconded with the box, he checked at the Foundling Hospital and found that a child had been brought there, wrapped in a blanket marked with Madame Danglars' initials, but that the person who dropped him off had returned to collect him a few months later. He knew then that the Corsican was raising their child. Madame Danglars and Villefort wonder to each other how the Count could have come into possession of their secret and whether he intends to make use of it. Knowing not his identity, they cannot account for any personal animosity he may feel toward them. Villefort determines to discover the identity of the Count of Monte Cristo. He discovers 2 names connected with the Count and makes appointments with them both, claiming to be a police detective. At his appointment with the Abbé Busoni, the Abbé tells him that the two of them grew up together, that the Count's real name is Zacone, and that he is the son of a wealthy shipbuilder from Malta. He reports that the Count's only enemy is named Lord Wilmore, who served with the Count in India. When Villefort inquires as to the purpose of the Count having purchased a house at Auteuil, the Abbé informs him that the Count plans to turn it into a mental asylum. At his meeting with Lord Wilmore, Villefort learns that the Count had discovered a silver mine while serving in the military, and that this was the source of his immense fortune. He had purchased the island of Monte Cristo simply for the sake of obtaining a title. Lord Wilmore claims that the Count had seduced his wife and that they had fought 3 duels together, at all of which the Count had proven superior. When Villefort applies to Lord Wilmore about the Count's purpose of purchasing a house at Auteuil, Lord Wilmore tells him that the Count believes there to be a mineral spring on the property, and for this purpose he has been digging up the garden. Satisfied that the Count's designs at Auteuil are not prompted by personal revenge toward himself or Madame Danglars, Villefort returns home and sleeps soundly. At her ball, Madame de Morcerf notices that the Count refuses to consume any food or drink and remembers that he also did so the last time he visited. Having always known his true identity as Edmond Dantes, she wonders if this abstinence is due to a grudge on account of her betrayal. She leads him away from the party into her garden, where she offers him multiple tempting fruits, to all of which he declines. In despair, she asks the Count if the two of them are friends, to which he gives a cold and unsatisfactory response. Keeping up with the pretenses they have never vocally acknowledged to be false, the Count tells her a half-true story of a fiancé he once had, who he found married when he returned home from war, and responds to her questions in a way that betrays the resentment he still carries for her, ill-masked by dispassionate unconcern. Mercedes is heartbroken, but Albert interrupts their conversation with an announcement that the Marchioness de Saint-Méran has just arrived at Paris, bringing news that the Marquis de Saint-Méran has died en route. The report, as well as Valentine's having fainted upon hearing it, quickly brings an end to the ball. The Marchioness is so deeply grieved by her husband's sudden death that she feels she too is on the point of death and urges Valentine to hasten her marriage with Franz. She claims to be experiencing hallucinations, having seen a ghostly white figure enter her room and touch the glass of orangeade that she keeps by her bedside. Valentine is alarmed at the sudden hastening of an alliance she hoped one day to dissolve, but she feels unable to confide in her grandmother about her love for Maximilian, as he is of inferior birth to Franz. When Valentine tells Maximilian that the marriage contract is to be signed that very evening, he proposes that they run away together to his sister's house where they can be married and then perhaps go on to America to start a new life together. Valentine declares herself too weak to defy her family's wishes. To this reply, Maximilian responds calmly and coldly, which alarms Valentine. She wrenches the truth from him. If she will not be his bride, he will jump into the river. Anguished at the thought of Maximilian dead, she finally consents to his plan. Maximilian procures a ladder and a cabriolet to facilitate her escape and waits by the garden wall, but when the appointed hour arrives, Valentine does not. He waits several hours and finally hops the fence and enters the garden, but upon hearing voices, he secrets himself to listen. It is Villefort and Dr. d'Avrigny, and Maximilian overhears the news that the Marchioness has now also died, and that the doctor highly suspects she was poisoned. Villefort is greatly disturbed, wanting no criminal scandal to come under the house of the Procureur du Roi. Morel sneaks into the house and finds Valentine weeping over the body of her grandmother. She proposes that they confide in Noirtier, who is shocked to hear that she is in love with another man, but motivated by a profound love for his granddaughter, as well as a disapproval of an alliance with the family of General de Canel, he promises to support them and advises them to trust him to see to everything. After the funeral of the Saint-Marans, a solemn meeting takes place for the signing of the marriage contract. Just as the signing is about to take place, Barrois, Noirtier's servant, enters and announces that Noirtier requests a meeting with Franz. Franz, well aware of Noirtier's disapproval and anxious to gain the favor of his betrothed grandfather, accedes to the request. Barrois, acting on Noirtier's orders, removes a document from a secret compartment in Noirtier's desk and presents it to Franz. The document, which Franz reads aloud, is a summary of the events leading up to his father's death. Backstory number 5. General de Canel, suspected of Bonapartist sympathies, was blindfolded and brought to the secret Bonapartist club where his membership was solicited, but he adamantly declined, declaring his allegiance to the king. Having been made to pronounce an oath of secrecy, he was allowed to depart. The president of the Bonapartist club accompanied General de Canel in his carriage. Insults were exchanged, and the president challenged the general to a duel in which General de Canel was killed. Franz is grieved to learn that his father died fair and square in a duel rather than having been assassinated as he had previously believed. He entreats Noirtier to reveal the name of the president. With the aid of the dictionary and the winking-blinking system of communication that Noirtier employs, Noirtier reveals that it was he who killed Franz's father. The engagement between Valentine and Franz is instantly dissolved. Part 8, I call this section Albert because this is essentially Albert's downfall, which is a big deal because he has been one of the main characters for the last several sections of this book. The Count pays a visit to Danglars, where Eugenie is quite busy in the next chamber singing and playing the piano with Louise d'Army. Danglars, anxious to facilitate an attachment between his daughter and Andrea Cavalcanti, leads the prince into the piano room where they all begin singing together. Albert soon joins the party, and Danglars continually directs the conversation to how well Eugenie and Andrea suit each other, but is annoyed when he fails to excite jealousy in Albert, whom, though his pride is wounded, secretly desires to be released of his obligation to Eugenie. At the Count's home, Albert is formally introduced to Haydée. The Count instructs Albert not to reveal his father's name in her presence or to ask any direct questions, and he instructs Haydée, in Greek, not to pronounce the name of the man who betrayed her father. Naturally, the conversation turns to Haydée's native land and childhood, and she shares backstory number 6. As the daughter of Ali Pasha, a great ruler in Yanina, Haydée holds the status of a princess. But when she was 4 years old, her entire household at her palace had to flee to a safe house to await either a pardon or an order for execution from the Sultan. Her father sent a trusted French officer to negotiate with the Sultan and bring back the news, and instructed his right-hand man, Selim, to rig the safe house with explosives. If they were granted pardon, they would return to their palace. If not, Selim would ignite the explosives, preventing the Sultan from seizing their treasure or weapons or capturing any members of their household. When the trusted French officer returned, having betrayed Ali Pasha to the Sultan, he gave Selim the false report that Ali Pasha had been pardoned. Selim triumphantly extinguished his torch and was at once captured by the Sultan's soldiers. The safe house was then besieged, Ali Pasha was killed in the battle, and Haiti and her mother were sold into slavery by the French officer. When she was 13, the Count purchased her freedom and has treated her like the princess she is ever since, raising her as his beloved daughter. After the engagement between Valentine and Franz was broken off, Madame de Villefort convinced Noirtier to reinstate Valentine as heiress to his fortune. Danglars meets with Morcerf to break off the engagement between his daughter and Albert. Morcerf is enraged, but Danglars rudely refuses to provide any reason for breaking their agreement. The next morning, Danglars smugly reads a newspaper article entitled "We Hear from Yanina," which reveals the name of Ali Pasha's betrayer to be Fernand, and he feels assured that Morcerf will require no explanation after he reads the article. Albert, having seen the article, hurries to the Count and requests that he be his second in a duel that he is determined to fight with Beauchamp. Albert explains that it is Beauchamp's newspaper which has published the article slandering his father. The Count entreats Albert not to be hasty and reasons that Fernand is a very common name and that no one knows it to be the real name of the Comte de Morcerf. Albert will hear no rational arguments. He is determined to fight for his father's honor. However, the Count does succeed in convincing Albert to go alone and discuss the matter with Beauchamp to clear it up amicably if possible before a duel is proposed. Albert comes in hot to the office of Beauchamp, who is completely ignorant of the article and certainly unaware of any connection with Albert or his father. He tries to calmly reason with Albert, but Albert rudely declares that he will settle for nothing short of a full retraction and will duel to the death if Beauchamp should he refuse. Beauchamp, having been thoroughly insulted, sharply dismisses Albert from his office after convincing him to agree to a 3-week postponement to investigate the source and validity of the claim. Noirtier sends Barrois to fetch Maximilien to discuss his future with Valentine, and in Maximilien's haste to join his lover, he and Barrois sprint all the way to the Villefort mansion. Valentine, seeing Barrois gasping for breath, suggests he drink the cold lemonade that had been prepared for Noirtier to drink. Valentine presents to Maximilien the plan that she and Noirtier have discussed. She will request from her parents that she and Noirtier be allowed to move into a house of their own, where she and Maximilien can be married. If her parents do not consent, they will wait a few more months until she is of age and can then move forward without their consent and with their inheritance from the Saint-Marins. Maximilien's rejoicings at the recital of this plan are interrupted by alarming struggles exhibited by Barrois. Dr. d'Avrigny is called, and after many moments of intense suffering, Barrois dies. The doctor tests the lemonade in a solution of syrup of violets and finds it to contain brucine, the very poison which he suspected had killed the Marchioness. As the lemonade had been prepared by Valentine and was intended for Noirtier, and since Valentine is Noirtier's sole heiress, Dr. d'Avrigny suspects her of both crimes. He denounces her to Villefort, who begs him for mercy. The doctor reluctantly agrees to remain quiet, but warns Villefort that the next time someone succumbs to poison in his house, Villefort is not to send for his aid. Meanwhile, Andrea and Danglars discuss an engagement. Andrea assures Danglars that he will receive millions after signing the marriage contract. When Andrea returns home, he finds that Caderousse has refused to accept his 200-franc blackmail payment and instead left a message for Andrea to meet him at his home. Andrea borrows his servant's attire so as not to look suspicious in the poorer area of town. Caderousse, ever greedy, reveals that he knows that Andrea is about to form an alliance with the Danglars and subtly demands more money from him. Andrea confides in Caderousse that he believes the Count of Monte Cristo is his real father, and that is why he has contrived to introduce him into society and provide for him. He believes he will one day inherit his fortune. Caderousse begins concocting a plan. He discovers from Andrea that the Count has a house in the Champs-Élysées from which he will be absent the following night. He asks Andrea to sketch the interior of the house and inquires about other particulars regarding the security of the house. Andrea informs him that his secretary is always kept unlocked, and he tests the authenticity of the diamond ring that Andrea is currently wearing on his finger by seeing if it will cut glass, and convinces Andrea to leave it behind so he doesn't look suspicious wearing a diamond ring with servant's livery. The Count receives an anonymous note from Andrea, informing him that a robbery will be committed at his house in the Champs-Élysées that night, and he quickly returns home from Auteuil, instructing all his servants to remain at Auteuil, taking with him only Ali. He double locks his secretary and pockets the key, secreting himself and Ali in the closet. After hours of waiting, they finally hear someone cutting through the window. Man enters, but the Count sees through his window that another man is helping to keep watch out in the street. Suddenly, the Count recognizes Caderousse. He quickly changes into his Abbé Busoni disguise and confronts him. He accuses Caderousse of robbing the Count of Monte Cristo and of escaping prison where he should have been at that moment for the murder of the jeweler. Caderousse explains that an Englishman named Lord Wilmore had liberated both himself and his jailmate Benedetto from prison, and reveals that Benedetto believes he is secretly the Count of Monte Cristo's son, he having provided Benedetto with money and a false identity, and that he is soon to wed Eugénie Danglars. The Abbé threatens to expose Benedetto's true identity to Danglars. Caderousse, anxious to profit from Benedetto's good fortune, tries to attack him, but the Abbé overpowers him and forces him to write a confession for breaking into the Count's home, including the detail that Benedetto was his accomplice in the crime. He then tells Caderousse that he leaves his fate to Providence, and that if Caderousse makes it home safely, he will believe God has forgiven him. During his escape, Caderousse is stabbed by Benedetto, who flees. The Abbé comes to Caderousse's aid and sends Ali for the procureur. Caderousse reasons that Benedetto had hoped either that Caderousse would kill the Count, thus making Benedetto his heir, or that the Count would kill Caderousse, thus ridding himself of a blackmailer. He begs the Abbé for a pen and paper, with which he writes and signs a statement for the procureur condemning Benedetto for the murder. The Abbé takes Caderousse through his many crimes, endeavoring to convince him of the reality of God and his justice. He then reveals his true identity as Edmond Dantes. Caderousse exclaims, "There must indeed be a God," and dies. One morning, Beauchamp's arrival is announced at Albert's chambers. Beauchamp explains sorrowfully that he has spent the entire 3 weeks traveling to Yanina and that he has just arrived back in Paris. He breaks the terrible news to Albert that not only was the report factual, but that it was indeed Fernand Mondego, the Comte de Morcerf himself, who betrayed Ali Pasha for the sum of 2 million crowns. Albert begs Beauchamp for forgiveness and entreats him to destroy the proof of the assertion and take a vow of secrecy. To mend their spirits, they decide to visit the Count of Monte Cristo, who proposes to Albert a sea voyage to Normandy. Albert agrees. However, on the day they reach Normandy, he is immediately called home by a servant who had been traveling nonstop to reach him on the orders of Beauchamp in response to a newspaper article just published detailing the full truth about Morcerf. Albert flies home as quickly as he can and receives the following report from Beauchamp. An unknown man, Danglars, had approached another paper with the requisite proofs condemning Morcerf as a traitor, assuring them that if they did not print, he would take the story to the rival paper. The next day, at the House of Peers, Morcerf was put on trial to determine the validity of the claims made. Morcerf brought forth many proofs to show that he had loyally served Ali Pasha for many years, convincing the peers of the validity of his story. However, a witness was announced, and Haydée entered the court, witnessing with intense fervor that the Comte de Morcerf was the very Fernand Mondego who had betrayed her father and sold her into slavery. Her veracity was undeniable, and the pity and indignation she inspired turned the whole house against Morcerf, who physically fled the scene, thereby testifying of his own guilt. Albert discovers that it was Danglars who wrote to Yanina for the particulars about his father and challenges him to a duel. However, the cowardly Danglars deflects blame onto the Count of Monte Cristo for initially suggesting the idea. Albert, shocked and outraged at the betrayal by his trusted friend, remembering that as Haydée's guardian, the Count must have known the secret all along, transfers the challenge to the Count. The Count, being proficient in all dueling weapons, will undoubtedly kill Albert if the duel moves forward, but Albert would rather die honorably than of filial shame. Mercédès comes to the Count and humbly beseeches him to spare her son, declaring that it is not the Comtesse de Morcerf asking this of the Count of Monte Cristo, but Mercédès asking it of Edmond Dantes. Dantes then reveals to Mercédès that Fernand was responsible for his imprisonment and shows her the letter that Fernand delivered to the police so many years ago. He confesses the history that has remained hitherto a mystery to her, that he spent 14 miserable years in the Chateau d'If, every day lamenting the loss of her whom he loved, and every day vowing to avenge himself. She begs for forgiveness and assures him that she too has suffered, being powerless for decades to do anything but weep and pray for him. She tells him that she dreamed the same dream for 10 years, that he, Edmond, had taken the place of a dead prisoner and had been thrown into the sea at the Chateau d'If and died. She begs for her son's life, and powerless against his passion for her, the Count agrees, knowing that he himself must therefore die in the duel. He bitterly laments the disruption of his plans, so carefully laid and worked on for years. Preparing for his own death, the Count writes his will in favor of Maximilian and Haydée. Haydée spies over his shoulder and declares that she will accept none of his fortune, for if he were to die, she would also die. She tears the will in pieces and faints from the effort. Those concerned in the duel gather at the agreed-upon place, but Albert is late. When he finally arrives, he humbly apologizes to the Count, having been informed by Mercedes of his father's crimes against Dantes. At the Morcerf residence, Mercedes and Albert both pack their things and prepare to forsake their fortune and sever connections with Fernand. Bertuccio delivers a letter to Albert from the Count, explaining that when he was about to marry Mercedes, he saved some money and buried it in his father's backyard and that it is still there. He instructs Albert to dig it up and give it to Mercedes for her survival. When the Count returns home, Haydée is overjoyed to find the Count alive, and he suddenly realizes that she must have romantic feelings for him, which gives him hope for happiness for the first time since his arrest. Fernand pays a visit to the Count, wishing to know the particulars of the duel, since both parties returned alive. The Count informs him that Albert apologized to him on the conviction that his father was more guilty than the Count. Fernand himself now challenges the Count to a duel, and the Count responds by recounting all the sordid details of Fernand's life. Fernand replies that as the Count appears to know so much about him, he would like to know who the Count is. The Count declares himself to be Edmond Dantes. Fernand, overwhelmed with terror and shame, flies home in his carriage where he sees his son and wife fleeing. He goes into his chambers and shoots himself. Part 9, Danglars and Villefort. We've already gotten revenge on Caderousse and Fernand Mondego, and in this section, we will get revenge on Danglars and Villefort. Noirtier, fearing that Valentine may be the next victim of the poisoner, slowly accustoms her system to brucine by administering some of his own medicine, which contains brucine, a few drops at a time to give her partial immunity. These efforts have saved her life, but not prevented her from becoming quite ill. At a visit with the Danglars women, Valentine becomes so feverish that she faints and is confined to her bed to rest. Villefort sends for Dr. d'Avrigny, who comes despite his previous avowal. Maximilian, terror-stricken, confesses his love for Valentine to the Count and implores him to intervene, knowing the Count to have a miraculous influence, even supernatural. The Count is dumbstruck as his long-laid plans have hit a major unforeseen snag. He's conflicted between his intense desire to both punish Villefort and promote Maximilian's happiness. He ultimately assures Maximilian that if Valentine hasn't succumbed yet, she will live. Maximilian entrusts the affair entirely to the Count. The Count, as the Abbé Busoni, rents out the house adjoining the Villefort mansion. Meanwhile, at Chez Danglars, Eugénie schedules a meeting with her father. She declares that she will not marry Andrea, and that she intends on marrying no man at all, desiring instead to become a famous singer and live an independent life. Danglars declares in his turn that he considered her wishes not a whit in his plans for her marriage and intends on recovering from bankruptcy through the financial agreements between him and Andrea. She points out that she has very recently seen him deposit $5 million into his bank account, and he informs her that he is only in charge of that money temporarily, and that it is actually a charitable fund for widows and orphans. Understanding perfectly that her father has pledged her for 3 million francs, Eugénie determines any argument useless and retires, declaring that she is ready to marry Andrea, but clearly concealing some secret of her own. At the signing of the contract, many members of Parisian society assemble. The Count enters and announces that the police have found a damning piece of evidence against Benedetto in the form of a letter in the pocket of a jacket left at the scene of the crime, which was addressed to Danglars. Andrea, panicked, steals whatever he can quickly get his hands on and sneaks out the back window. Just as his presence is missed, gendarmes come pouring into the room, declaring that Andrea Cavalcanti is in reality the escaped convict Benedetto, who is wanted for the much-talked-of recent murder at the home of the Count of Monte Cristo. Taking advantage of the confusion, Eugenie and Louise d'Army commence a plan that they had formed to escape the marriage. Eugenie disguises herself in men's clothing, chops off her hair, and runs away with Louise in possession of a man's passport, claiming that the bearer is traveling with his sister. They escape via a back staircase and alight in a previously hired carriage. Meanwhile, Andrea Cavalcanti has also escaped via the same route. He travels along the way until he reaches the Bell and Bottle Inn, where he checks into room 7, as the room he requested, number 3, was already occupied by a young man traveling with his sister. He sleeps late, like an idiot, and wakes to the sound of gendarmes who had tracked him to the hotel banging at his door. He shimmies up the chimney, and to avoid being captured on the roof, slides down the chimney leading to another of the hotel rooms. Unfortunately for Andrea, it is the room of Eugenie and Louise, who yell for help. Recognizing Andrea, they agree to allow him to escape, but the gendarmes catch him first. The next day, the two girls successfully arrive in Brussels, and Benedetto is incarcerated. Madame Danglars slowly realized the shame and ruin that has come upon her family as a result of the scandal. She seeks consolation from Villefort, to whom she implores to show mercy to Andrea, now revealed to be Benedetto. They discuss the fact that Benedetto's parentage is unknown. Madame Danglars warns him that if he shows no mercy to others, he can expect no mercy from others to himself. The Count secretly watches over Valentine, and each night replaces her poisoned cup with a draught that will improve her strength. On the 4th night, she is sufficiently conscious to notice his presence and is alarmed and indignant to see the Count of Monte Cristo at her bedside. He explains that he is working on behalf of Maximilian and has only watched for the poisoner's movements to ensure that her beverages stay potable. He tells her that if she watches carefully, she will see the poisoner enter the room and learn the identity of the killer for herself. She feigns sleep and is shocked and paralyzed when she sees Madame de Villefort enter her room and contaminate her cup. When she exits, the Count returns and informs Valentine that a new poison has been substituted and that Valentine's immunity against brucine will no longer help her. He convinces her that Madame de Villefort will never stop attempting Valentine's life because she wants Valentine's fortune to revert to her own son, Edward. Assuring her that he regards her as his child now, he alludes to a plan he has concocted to preserve her for Maximilian and administers to her a drug, warning her not to be alarmed even if she were to awaken in a tomb. Fearing for her life, but trusting in her only option to live and be with Maximilian, she consents to taking the drug. The next morning, her body lays lifeless on her bed, and the whole household is incensed. Dr. Davrigny tests her cup and finds its contents to be poisoned. Maximilian enters the room, having heard alarming cries from outside, and is questioned by Villefort, who is himself grief-stricken. Maximilian confesses that he was Valentine's lover and drags Noirtier and his armchair upstairs in an impossible feat of strength so that Noirtier can corroborate his right to weep over Valentine's body. Maximilian and Dr. Davrigny unite in demanding the procureur seek justice. He assures them that justice will be done if they keep silent for a short time. The Abbé Busoni, who conveniently lives next door, is called to pray over the deceased Valentine, where he is left alone in the room with Noirtier. Villefort deals with his grief by working tirelessly on the deposition for Benedetto. Noirtier, surprisingly, seems at peace with the whole affair. None of Valentine's family attend her funeral. The Count approaches Danglars about claiming the remaining 5 million francs from his letter of credit. Danglars, to save face, pays him the 5 million owed to the widows and orphans. He then grabs his passport, leaves a note for his wife, and flees the country. After Valentine's entombment, the Count finds Maximilian skulking in the shadows. Maximilian feels completely betrayed by the Count and does not seek to conceal his anger. The Count follows him to his house as he suspects his plans and barges into Maximilian's room. He sees him writing a suicide note and fails to convince him not to follow through with his plans. Finally, as a last resort, he reveals himself to be Edmond Dantes, the preserver of his father, the long-sought-for benefactor of the entire Morel family. Maximilian, awed, shouts for Julie and Emmanuel to come and bow down before Dantes. Dantes is humbled, and Maximilian is reminded of miracles and hope. Dantes convinces Maximilian to postpone his suicide plans until the 5th of October. Having lost her daughter and received Danglars' sarcastic farewell note, Madame Danglars hastens to her lover for comfort and protection. Debray, realizing her access to her husband's fortune is now cut off and she can therefore no longer benefit him financially, returns her fear and grief with coldness. In a detached and businesslike manner, he closes their accounts and pays her the sum owed to her from their speculation schemes. In a heartbroken daze, she departs. Across town, Albert and Mercedes are settling their finances as well. Albert has decided to join the military in Africa, and Mercedes, who wants nothing and feels she has one foot in the grave, is to stay on in Marseille. Bertuccio visits Benedetto in prison, and Benedetto demands to know the identity of his real father, which Bertuccio grants. Meanwhile, Villefort continues to distract himself from his grief and shame by pouring himself into the preparation of his deposition against Benedetto. True to his word to Dr. d'Avrigny and Maximilian, and bracing himself for the ordeal he's about to undergo, he confronts his wife with her crimes and demands that she administer to herself some of her own poison, declaring that she will die either privately by her own hand or scandalously on the scaffold. At the commencement of Benedetto's trial, he is asked a few questions concerning his identity, namely his age and name. He explains that he was born September 27, 1817 at Auteuil, and that he is unable to give his true name, as he is ignorant of the name his parents officially gave him, having been adopted as a newborn baby. The crowd finds this answer impertinent, but Villefort's heart is filled with terror at the pronouncement of Benedetto's birthplace, and a woman in the audience, Madame Danglars, who had moments before recovered from a fainting fit, now becomes completely hysterical. Benedetto continues, while his true name is officially unknown, he has recently learned the name of his father and can at least provide that. He announces that his father's name is Villefort, and having been buried alive by his parents, miraculously discovered by his adopted father, but condemned to a life of misery and crime, having been abandoned from birth, even providing details about his story that completely convince Villefort of Benedetto's true identity. The court demands proof of the assertion, and Benedetto declares that they need only gaze upon the countenance of the procureur for evidence of the truth. Indeed, Villefort is entirely unable and even unwilling to mask the truth of Benedetto's assertions, and declares himself guilty before the court and prepared to submit to the authority of the procureur who will succeed him. Overcome with grief, horror, and shame, Villefort races home to beg forgiveness of his wife, wishing to atone for his hypocrisy in dealing with her. He hopes to find her still alive, in which case he will forgive all, hoping that she will allow him the same grace, and the two of them can flee from Paris and live humbly with each other as their only comforts for the rest of their lives. He bursts into her chambers just in time to see her body crash to the floor. He frantically calls for his son, but ultimately finds his body lifeless near his wife's, who, having done all for Edward's sake, could not bear to leave her son behind. Dantes enters as the Abbé Busoni, announcing to Villefort that his debt has been paid, and reveals himself to be Edmond Dantes. Villefort takes Dantes by the arm and drags him upstairs to his wife's chambers, revealing to him that Edward also lies dead. Dantes, shocked and horrified, frantically attempts to save Edward by administering his special medicine to no avail. He realizes he has gone beyond the bounds of justice and that God is no longer with him. Villefort, now completely mad, flies to the garden, muttering to himself, and begins digging up the garden with his bare hands, seeking for his lost child. All right, we've reached our final section. This is section 10, and I call this the miracle. Dantes and Maximilian, who are preparing to depart from Paris, take leave of Julie and Emmanuel. Maximilian still resents the Count for failing to save Valentine, but for the sake of what he did for his father, is adhering to his wishes that he wait until October 5th to kill himself. Now that his grand plot of vengeance has come to fruition, Dantes is filled with uncertainty about the justice of it. They dock in Marseille, and while Maximilian goes to pray over his father's grave, Dantes visits Mercedes, who is completely humbled, hopeless, and crippled by despair. She declares that she was weak, faithless, and entirely to blame for abandoning Dantes. She tells him, "The comparison I draw between you and other men will ever be one of my greatest tortures." He promises to take it upon himself to promote Albert's welfare for her sake. They discuss free agency, God, and justice. Feeling more in doubt than ever about the morality and justice of his plot of vengeance, Dantes visits the Château d'If, which is no longer used as a prison, but still kept by a guard. Dantes requests of the guard a tour of the prison and listens to the stories that the guard knows about the prisoners who had been incarcerated there. Now back in the place of his torture, Dantes is reminded of the immensity of his sufferings and trauma, and once again feels justified in his revenge. The jailer tells him about the mad abbe who believed in a treasure and shows Dantes the manuscript he had found hidden in the walls of the prisoner's cell, which Dantes purchases from the jailer. Dantes takes the miraculous recovery of his beloved Abbe Faria's manuscript as a sign from God that he is forgiven, and finally, feeling justified, he returns to Maximilian, who will remain in Marseille until October 5th, at which time they will meet on the island of Monte Cristo. Meanwhile, Danglars, who is fleeing Paris, arrives in Rome, where he is reimbursed by the House of Thompson and French for the 5 million francs he had credited to the Count of Monte Cristo. While on the road, Peppino hijacks Danglars' carriage and brings him to the catacombs. After several hours of imprisonment, Danglars demands to speak to the leader of the banditti. Luigi Vampa presents himself and offers Danglars food, but with a small catch. Every item on the menu will cost Danglars 100,000 francs. Danglars is outraged, realizing that the banditti plan to slowly drain him of all his funds, which, as we remember, are the last he possesses. At first, he refuses to comply, but hunger eventually prompts him to spend 5 million of the 5,050,000 francs he had in his possession, leaving him unable to purchase any more food. Eventually, once he has suffered the agonies of starvation for several days in his prison cell and feels he is on the brink of death, Luigi Vampa agrees to present his superior, in whom Danglars recognizes the Count of Monte Cristo. Having submitted Danglars to the same tortures of starvation both he and his father suffered at Danglars' hands, the Count reveals himself to be none other than Edmond Dantes. He explains that the 5 million francs they have just extracted from him will be returned to the widows and orphans, and instructs Luigi Vampa to allow Danglars to eat as much as he wants before setting him and his 50,000 remaining francs free. On the 5th of October, Maximilian meets the Count in his grotto on the island of Monte Cristo. The Count explains that he has learned that the degree of suffering we've experienced is what determines the degree to which we can feel happiness. He then administers hashish to Maximilian, who believes it to be poison. As the effect of the drugs begin to take hold, the Count lets Valentine, who had been staying in the grotto with Haydée, into Maximilian's presence, and he dreams he is seeing her as an angel in heaven. When he awakens, he discovers that they are both still alive. The Count hopes that the happiness he has brought to Maximilian and Valentine will be sufficient to atone for all the evils he committed in the name of vengeance. He instructs Valentine to love and care for Haydée as a sister and announces his plans to depart, perhaps meaning that he plans to kill himself. Haydée, having just entered the room and heard his words, declares that she shall die if he leaves her, and that she loves him as Valentine loves Maximilian. The Count, who had never before allowed himself to believe in her love, finally feels hope for his own future happiness, and the two sail away together. Maximilian is left with a note from the Count explaining that Noirtier awaits their arrival. He advises them that there is no happiness nor misery in the world, only comparison with one state to another. He requests their prayers to God on his behalf for forgiveness, having learned that God alone can possess supreme power and wisdom. Maximilian and Valentine wave goodbye to the Count, and Haydée's ship on the horizon. Ta-da! That's the end. If you made it to the end, that is honestly insane. I hope you understand this plot a little bit better. I wanted to finish off this video by discussing the ending, because sometimes if you hate the ending, you hate the book. And a lot of people have issues with this ending. So do I. But I think it makes more sense than you might think. So I wanted to talk about that. So first of all, Mercedes, Alexandre Dumas did her so dirty. She deserved so much more. She ended up sad and alone, even though in my opinion, she never did anything wrong. The only thing she is guilty of is having not killed herself and moved on with her life. She didn't do anything that I would not have done myself. According to the honor system of the book, when it was clear that he was not coming back and he was probably presumed dead, she was supposed to have killed herself. It is what it is. I don't agree with it, but in the moral system of this book, that's the reality. So by that argument, they could never actually end up together because she was not honorable and she was guilty. However, there's quite a double standard there, because you have to be able to apply that to Edmond Dantes as well. And if he moves on and gets with Haydée, then he is not honorable either. And so it's like they're not being held to the same standard here. When Valentine tells Maximilian that she is going to marry Franz, he says, okay, well, the moment you sign the marriage contract, I'm going to kill myself. Because in this honor system with lovers, you be with them and no one else. You be with them or no one else. You be with them or you kill yourself. So just as Maximilian was wanting to kill himself if Valentine married Franz, Edmond Dantes, if he was to remain honorable, could not have been with Haiti, right? If he can't be with Mercedes, then he can't be with anyone. So there is that double standard there, and it doesn't actually make sense when you think about it. So in my perfect version of the story, Mercedes does end up with Edmond Dantes again, especially since her husband was already dead. Just as she brings Albert as a son to that new family, the Count brings Haiti as a daughter to that new family. I think that would have been really nice. However, in the story, he ends up with Haiti. And I don't think that that's a horrible ending to the story. I do think it makes sense, and I want to explain why, because a lot of people think it's just creepy. And is it creepy? Yes, it is creepy, but there's more to it than that. He's 42 years old, she's 20, he's raised her since she was 12. So he's twice her age, old enough to be her father. It is creepy. If you think that age gaps always mean creepiness, especially if you consider the fact that he was raising her since she was very young. But setting that aside, do they make a good couple? Yes, absolutely. They bond over grief, betrayal, trauma, and vengeance. They are both highly honorable and extremely hot. They're the two hottest people in this book. He truly has been her savior. While some would argue that he groomed her, I would argue that he genuinely won her heart. She's definitely, from my opinion, seems more likely to have killed herself if anything happened to Dante. And that's all Dantes wants. He just wants a woman that would kill herself if anything happened to him. There was no romance between them whatsoever until the final pages of the book. She was not his mistress. That's something that can be really easy to misread. She's not his mistress. There's no sexual relationship. There's no romantic feelings. I think there definitely were on her side, which makes sense. I mean, he rescued her when she was a teenager, treated her like a queen, gave her everything she wanted. So it makes sense that she would be in love with him. I think he had so much revenge and feelings for Mercedes in his heart that he just never saw her that way. And it wasn't until the moment he resolved things on that score that he was able to see her that way. So he was not in love with her when she was young. It wasn't until she was 20 years old that he started feeling those feelings. He didn't purchase her as a slave. He bought her freedom. He purchased her freedom. He didn't purchase her. He treated her like a queen. He treated her like a daughter. He made her his heiress. She was free to go at any time. So you may ask, then why is she presented as a slave in the book? Why do people call her his slave? Why does he himself refer to her as his slave? I think there are many reasons, but one of them is that if she is presented as a slave in Parisian society, then when they find out that she was a princess who was betrayed and sold into slavery, that makes her betrayer all the more a villain. If they know her as a slave, it makes it even more devastating that she used to be a princess and was betrayed. And then they just really want to bring justice to her betrayer. And that's exactly what happened with Fernand Mondego. So that's what I think. There's a lot of ambiguous morality in this book. There's a lot of room for discussion and things that we're going to disagree about with Dumas, and also we're going to disagree amongst each other. I think that's what makes this an amazing book. So there you have it. There's the Count of Monte Cristo.